with interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on situation of human rights in Eritrea, pursuant to Council Resolution number 41/1. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. It's my pleasure to give the floor to Ms. Daniela Cravatis for her presentation via video message.
Madam President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to join this session of the Human Rights Council and present my second annual report on the situation of human rights in Eritrea. I would like to begin by wishing all participants in this session good health and by thanking the organizers for facilitating my intervention. Before turning to my report, I note that, like other countries across the globe, Eritrea has been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. In recent weeks, as the authorities have expanded their testing, the number of confirmed cases has also increased, although the numbers reported remain low. We must be conscious, however, that the actual numbers will likely be higher. I am concerned that the COVID-19 pandemic is exacerbating the situation of famine and malnutrition that exists in parts of the country and is contributing to food shortages, in part due to the border closure and the restrictions on food imports currently in place. For example, recent reports indicate that disadvantaged populations in and around the towns of Massawa and Assab and in regions bordering Ethiopia and Sudan have been experiencing severe food shortages. I urge the Eritrean authorities to ensure, with the assistance of their international partners, that emergency food supplies reach all segments of the population during this difficult period. Turning now to my report. Over this past year, I have seen no tangible evidence of a meaningful and substantive improvement in the situation of human rights in Eritrea. In my report, I set out specific areas of concern in relation to 5 benchmarks for progress. In my remarks today, I wish to focus on 3 key areas where reforms would signal that Eritrea is moving in a positive direction. First, to demonstrate progress in human rights, an important initial step is for the Eritrean authorities to address the situation of those arbitrarily and unlawfully detained, and of those who have disappeared in the prison system. I have repeatedly raised this issue and have noted the lack of progress regarding the situation of political prisoners, prisoners of conscience, and others arbitrarily and unlawfully detained. It is quite striking that the Eritrean authorities remain completely silent on this issue. There are many unanswered questions regarding individual cases. For example, where is Siham Ali Abdu, held for almost 8 years, and when will she be released? After 2 years in detention, where is Berhane Abrehe, and when will he be released? After 19 years in detention, where is Dawit Isaak, and when will he be released? And when will the authorities release Paulo Sayasu, Isaac Mogos, and Negede Tekle Mariam, 3 conscientious objectors held for 26 years? The Eritrean authorities will demonstrate their genuine commitment to human rights when they release those individuals arbitrarily held in Eritrean prisons and provide information about those who have disappeared to their families. Second, to advance towards meaningful and sustainable development, Eritrea must invest in its youth. This requires the creation of positive conditions, encouraging, among other things, youth to remain in the country. During this past year, we have seen a steady flow of youth fleeing from Eritrea. These young people are not leaving because they're being lured out of the country by the refugee camps in neighboring Ethiopia, as the Eritrean authorities claim, but because they have no prospects for a future in Eritrea. Of particular concern is the high number of children among those leaving. Up until the COVID-19 restrictions came into effect in March, over 20% of those fleeing from Eritrea into Ethiopia on a monthly basis were unaccompanied children. More than 40% of Eritrean refugees currently living in camps in Ethiopia are children. In the early months of this year, around 10% of Eritrean refugees crossing into Sudan were unaccompanied minors. While we're now living in unusual times due to the COVID-19 pandemic and travel and movement restrictions are in effect, once these restrictions are eased, this exodus of Eritrea's youth will continue. It is difficult to envisage a sustainable and prosperous future for Eritrea without its young people. As I have outlined in detail in my report, for Eritrea to support its youth, reforms are needed on various fronts, including in job creation, in the promotion of civil liberties, in education, and yes, in the national service. Third, to build the foundations for a thriving society, the Eritrean authorities must open civic space for independent civil society. Today, there is no space for independent human rights defenders, members of political opposition, and independent journalists. In this last year, we have witnessed the increased shrinking of civic space in Eritrea, with the arrest of practitioners of different congregations during prayer gatherings, of members of minority groups, and of persons who have expressed dissent. In several instances, institutions that have called for reforms and have questioned the actions of the government have themselves faced reprisals, as in the case of the Catholic Church and of various Islamic institutions. An open civic space is a basic pillar for the success of any nation. Finally, I wish to note that after 2 years of joining this council, Eritrea has yet to cooperate with my mandate and with other UN special procedures. The Eritrean authorities have complained that my report presents a distorted picture of the situation in the country. At the same time, the authorities continue to refuse me access to the country, refuse to meet with me, and do not respond to my request for input to my report. In my previous interventions before this council, I have openly invited the Eritrean authorities to discuss human rights issues with me, and I remain willing to engage in constructive dialogue with them. Given that this is the 8th year since the creation of this mandate, I wish that I could present a more positive report on the situation of human rights in Eritrea, but due to the lack of progress, I cannot. I urge the Eritrean authorities to be forward-looking and to introduce much-needed reforms to ensure the full enjoyment of basic rights for all Eritreans. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Now, according to our practice, we shall start by hearing from the delegation of the country concerned, and I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eritrea. You have 5 minutes, sir.
It's reflected to the actions of the Special Rapporteur, particularly with regard to the pandemic. Eritrea is among the most successful countries in the world to combat this pandemic, but a lot remains to be done. To go to my statement, thank you, Mr. President. In other ways, extremely busy Council, discussions on Eritrea appear in more than one agenda in 2 of the 3 annual sessions in the last 8 years. The monopoly of the sessions under different fashions starts by an oral update in the March sessions and goes on to enhance the interactive dialogue on the 2 parallel mechanisms to keep Eritrea at the top agenda of the Council. The most astonishing part of the exercise is not only the overwhelming domination of the deliberations, but the power vested on the Commission of Inquiry and the Special Rapporteur, who operate either together or parallel to freely define and limit their mandate, label crimes at wish, and collect information without any oversight. The current recycled report is the extension of the previous mandate under different agenda item and could not be expected to serve any better. Mr. Vice President, let me now briefly revert to the most egregious parts of the report, mainly the prospects of peace and national service. 1. Undermining the prospects of peace. The report wrongfully asserts that the dividends of the peace have yet to materialize for the people of Eritrea. The shallowness apparent in this sweeping, utterly negative and presumptive conclusions is appalling. Ethiopia and Eritrea went on a vicious border war for 3 years. The peace and friendship agreement signed between the 2 countries in Asmara on 9 July 2018 is of immense significance, both for the message of optimism, hope, and enduring reconciliation. Significance, both for the message of optimism, hope, and enduring reconciliation. What has been accomplished in the past 2 years is substantial by any standard, but in spite of all the manifest political goodwills, building durable peace is not a simple undertaking that will materialize overnight with a stroke of a pen. Nevertheless, the tempo, overall direction, and the future prospects of the peace process is overly positive and much more advanced in comparative terms with other analogous and the contemporaneous peace process underway elsewhere in the world. On national service, the report also claims that national service remains to be the main driver for migration from Eritrea. This is a wholesale resuscitation without independent validation of a worn-out and distorted narrative of the past. The real reason for disproportionate migration of Eritrean youth to Europe in the past years, which does not also reflect current realities, lies in misguided policies of certain powers to win the youth from their national service and thereby degrade Eritrea's defense capabilities. In many European countries, around 60% of the asylum seekers are actually citizens of neighboring countries who pose as Eritreans due to the preferential treatment accorded to them. Mr. Vice President, Excellencies, dear colleagues, despite the heavy effect of hostilities, Eritrea's ground reality reflects a people-centered development progress driven by the equal rights and opportunities, responsible participation of the people, equitable consideration and distribution of wealth, and the resources that have laid solid ground for peace and security. Under the favorable conditions of international and regional peace and development, Eritrea is seizing the opportunity to redouble its efforts, consolidate the progress made, address past challenges and problems, and achieve an inclusive and rapid economic growth predicted on social justice. The 2019-2020 transitional measures are showing results, leveling the ground for the implementation of the 11 national strategic objectives and areas declared in 2018 for the years ahead, with wider implication to peace and security and human rights and development. Respect for fundamental international principles, including the state's primary responsibility in the promotion of human rights, remains a work in progress, and engagement in international cooperation predicted on partnership and the critical necessities for addressing the challenge is still necessary. Yet again, the core group failed to recognize the fruits of cooperation, and they are now mobilizing themselves to come up with a new resolution. We call all partners to opt for engagement for the fruitful and cooperative manner. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. Now, the list of speakers is now closed, and I invite interested delegations to ask questions to the Special Rapporteur and to make comments on her report. And I'll give the floor to the representative of the European Union. You have the floor, sir.
Very much, Mr. Vice President. We thank the Special Rapporteur for her presentation and support her mandate. We welcome Eritrea's increased engagement with regional and international actors. However, these developments have not translated into tangible human rights reforms on the ground. We remain concerned about the indefinite national service, one of the main drivers of immigration, the serious violations of human rights, including indefinite and arbitrary detention and enforced disappearances, inhuman prison conditions, and persistent forms of gender-based violence need to be addressed urgently. The European Union stands ready to assist Eritrea in addressing these challenges. We urge the government to lift the severe restrictions imposed on religious communities and church-based organizations. The closure and confiscation of faith-based health facilities exemplify violations of freedom of religion or belief, and also the right of health, as well as of land and property rights, including those of foreign communities. Access to health facilities is urgently needed. We urge Eritrea to uphold the promotion and protection of human rights, to fully cooperate with the Special Rapporteur and with the thematic special procedure mandate holders and UN human rights mechanisms, granting them full and unhindered access to the country, and to adopt the proposed benchmarks. Mrs. Kravets, Mrs. Special Rapporteur, how can the international community best assist Eritrea in urgently reforming the national service? I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I'll give the floor to Germany.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Madam Special Rapporteur, Germany aligns itself with the EU statement. We would like to thank the Special Rapporteur for her report. Your mandate continues to enjoy our full support. Although a positive momentum has been created in the region by the peace agreement between Eritrea and Ethiopia in 2018, the human rights situation in Eritrea has not improved. It remains a matter of concern and should be closely monitored. We are especially concerned by the lack of progress with regard to the unlimited involuntary conscription into the national service, and alarmed by the heavy restrictions on civil and political rights. You propose concrete steps to address these and other important issues. We call upon Eritrea to implement the necessary legal and institutional reforms to meet the benchmarks. In line with your report, we also urge the government of Eritrea to free all political prisoners immediately and to stop the continuing practice of arbitrary arrest and detentions. Germany further encourages the government of Eritrea, a member of this council, to fully cooperate with these special procedures. This includes the Special Rapporteur, who should be allowed to access all parts of the country. Mrs. Kravets, you called for the release of political prisoners and low-risk offenders due to the risk they faced during the COVID pandemic in crowded jails. Have you seen any progress? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Belgium.
Merci, Monsieur le Vice-Président. La Belgique.
Thank you. Belgium aligns with the statement by the EU. First, I want to thank the Special Rapporteur for her work and the presentation of her report. Belgium takes note of the fact that Eritrea has not been open to cooperating with OHCHR to implement the recommendations of the UPR, and deplores the unwillingness to receive the Special Rapporteur in the country. We regret the absence of any sign of tangible improvements at the level of the human rights situation in the country. Belgium is gravely concerned, inter alia, by the number of arbitrary detentions and enforced disappearances. Moreover, the national service appears to be an obstacle to peace and economic social development of the country. Nevertheless, Belgium welcomes the fact that Eritrea did participate in the interactive dialogue with the Committee for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. We urge Eritrea to urgently implement all the recommendations of the committee to restore the rule of law. Belgium reiterates that Eritrea also undertook commitments pursuant to its accession to other conventions, such as the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. With lack of any significant progress in human rights in Eritrea, Belgium fully supports the renewal of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur. Thank you.
Je donne la parole à la France.
Give the floor to France. Thank you, President. France aligns with the statement delivered by the EU. I thank the Special Rapporteur for the presentation of her report and reiterate the full support of France to her mandate, which she's carrying out in difficult conditions and whose extension we support. The Eritrean authorities have shown no willingness to cooperate with the international mechanisms for follow-up on human rights, in particular with the OHCHR. even though the country is a member of this council, an elected member. For the last year, the human rights situation in Eritrea has not seen any improvement. We remain particularly troubled by the persistence of grave restrictions on fundamental freedoms, arbitrary detention and enforced disappearances, including within penitentiary facilities. France, again, encourages the Eritrean authorities to put an end to national service for an indefinite period and to pursue its efforts to combat violence and discrimination based on gender, including against sexual exploitation that many Eritrean women and girls continue to be victims of. France encourages the authorities to cooperate with the human rights follow-up mechanisms, in particular with Council special procedures, and to implement the recommendations accepted during the UPR of January 2019. Thank you.
Merci à vous. I'll give the floor to Australia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Australia thanks the Special Rapporteur for her update. We strongly endorse the mandate of the Special Rapporteur and, as a group member of the associated resolution, we will be supporting its renewal this session. We repeat our calls on the Eritrean government to cooperate with the mandate. It is incumbent on Council members to uphold the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights and to fully cooperate with the Council. We note some positive steps in the justice system and police reform, but we remain concerned by reports of torture and arbitrary and indefinite detention in Eritrea. We call on the government of Eritrea to implement comprehensive reforms, to ensure the criminal justice system is transparent, fair and equitable. Australia is troubled by the high number of women and girls exposed to human trafficking and sexual exploitation in Eritrea. We urge the Eritrean government to strengthen efforts to curb human trafficking and to protect the rights of victims, including by building on its National Action Plan and Steering Committee to address gender-based violence. We remain concerned by reports of prolonged and compulsory national service, particularly amongst children. Australia asks the Special Rapporteur how the international community and the Council can assist Eritrea in meeting the benchmarks outlined in your report. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Give the floor to Spain.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, President. Spain thanks the Rapporteur for the detailed report and regrets the lack of cooperation by the government with the majority of the universal human rights mechanisms, especially with the Rapporteur and with the OHCHR. Our country expresses its profound concern at the absence of progress in improving the human rights situation in Eritrea. Spain condemns the persistence of grave human rights violations that include protracted arbitrary detention and enforced disappearances geared towards repressing dissent, persecuting religious minorities and restricting civil freedoms and political rights. Therefore, we call for the release of all prisoners of conscience and those detained for their religious beliefs, some of whom have spent almost 20 years in prison. We urge the government to implement the necessary reforms to guarantee for Eritrean citizens the full enjoyment of civil freedoms that have so far been severely restricted, as well as a safe, conducive environment for human rights defenders and journalists. We also state our concern at the restrictions imposed on activities of various religions, including the Catholic Church, which is linked to provision of healthcare and education services. Spain urges the government to establish a roadmap to put an end to indefinite military service and to accelerate the adoption of a constitution that would allow progress to be made towards building the rule of law which would guarantee the protection of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Croatia.
Thank you. Mr. President, Vice President, Croatia aligns itself with the EU statement. We thank Mrs. Kravitz for her report. We reiterate our firm support for her mandate and regret the government of Eritrea's continued refusal to cooperate with the Special Rapporteur mandated by the very same UN body of which Eritrea is a member. While Croatia had hoped to see changes in regional dynamics translate into concrete and sustainable progress, we are disappointed by the report's findings of continued and widespread human rights violations. We share in particular the Special Rapporteur's concerns that despite Eritrea's announced reforms in the duration of the military service, the government has continued to forcibly round up young people for conscription, leading them to abandon school early or flee the country. We reiterate our call on Eritrea to end this practice, abolish indefinite national service and recognize the right to conscientious objection to military service in law and practice. We also urge Eritrea to abide by its international legal obligations under the ICCPR, to respect freedom of religion and belief, as well as to guarantee that no one is detained for peacefully expressing its opinion. Political prisoners and prisoners of conscience must be released immediately. As a member of the Human Rights Council, Eritrea has a duty to uphold the highest human rights standards and to cooperate with the Council and its mechanisms. We call on Eritrea to build on its recent successful engagement with CEDAW and to cooperate fully with the OHCHR and all UN human rights mechanisms and special procedures mandate holders. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement and would like to add the following remarks in our national capacity. We thank Special Rapporteur Ms. Kravets for her report and reaffirm our full support for her mandate. As a member of this Council, Eritrea has a special responsibility to uphold the highest human rights standards and to fully cooperate with all its mechanisms. However, the human rights situation in Eritrea shows no improvement 2 years after the historic peace agreement. The Netherlands is particularly worried about the continued practice of indefinite national service, of arbitrary detentions, the absence of a valid constitution and rule of law, and the absence of freedom of expression. A free and independent press continues to be absent in Eritrea. Moreover, we are greatly concerned by the severe restrictions imposed on religious communities and church-based organizations. We urge Eritrea to respect the right to freedom of religion or belief for all and to release all prisoners of faith immediately. It is essential that the human rights situation in Eritrea is assessed independently. We therefore urge the government of Eritrea to cooperate with and allow access to the Special Rapporteur and other human rights mechanisms. Ms. Kravets, in your view, what is the way forward in improving human rights in Eritrea and advancing freedom of religion? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Greece aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. We would like to thank the Special Rapporteur, Ms. Kravets, and welcome her report and its use of a benchmark approach. Greece regrets that the Special Rapporteur has found no evidence of a substantial improvement in the situation of human rights in Eritrea, nor any improvement in the working environment for independent human rights defenders, members of the political opposition, and independent journalists. The clear assessment that there is no space for independent civil society in Eritrea is particularly worrisome. We share the Special Rapporteur's concern regarding the continued use of indefinite and arbitrary detention and enforced disappearance in order to suppress dissent, punish perceived opponents and restrict civil liberties, as well as for the persistence of an indefinite national military service, and we call on Eritrea to take measures to address these issues. We would also like to reiterate the necessity for Eritrea to take concrete measures to ensure and guarantee the protection of land and property rights, including those of the foreign communities, diplomatic and consular missions, as well as religious institutions pursuant to international standards. We deplore that Eritrea keeps squandering opportunities to achieve progress in the field of human rights. HRC membership entails increased responsibilities, which should include the full and unhindered cooperation with its mandate holders. Madam Special Rapporteur, your work clearly illustrates that the mandate you have been entrusted with is crucial and that it, unfortunately, remains clearly necessary. We therefore fully support its renewal. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Austria.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Austria aligns itself with a statement delivered by the European Union. We thank the Special Rapporteur for her insightful report and presentation and reaffirm our support to her mandate. Although 2 years ago a positive momentum was created in the region by the peace process between Eritrea and Ethiopia, the human rights situation in Eritrea still remains a matter of concern and needs thus to be closely monitored. While we welcome that Eritrea has increased its engagement with regional and international actors throughout the last year, this engagement has not yet translated into tangible reforms in human rights. Austria is particularly concerned about the continued practice of indefinite national service, about allegations of arbitrary detentions, severe restrictions placed on freedom of religion or belief, and the absence of basic freedoms such as freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. We reiterate our request to Eritrea to closely cooperate with the various UN mechanisms, including OHCHR and UN Special Procedure mandate holders, in its effort to protect and promote human rights. The Special Rapporteur's mandate is pivotal in this regard, and she should be granted access to Eritrea. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give floor to Switzerland.
Monsieur le Vice-Président.
Thank you, Vice President. Switzerland is grateful to the Special Rapporteur for her report. Like her, my country regrets the lack of substantive improvements in the human rights situation in Eritrea in the period concerned. Implementation of the recommendations of the report for the 5 benchmarks that would allow the government to carry out the necessary reforms, bolstering rule of law, reform of national service, promotion of the right to freedom of religion, rights of freedom of expression, and promoting gender equality are part of the fundamental standards that need to be reached. It's crucial to make progress there. Switzerland calls on the Eritrean government to analyse and follow up on the recommendations and to enhance its cooperation with the Human Rights Council mechanisms and OHCHR. It urges it to authorise a visit by the Special Rapporteur and to facilitate the work of humanitarian organisations and other international partners. Switzerland therefore welcomes the cooperation by the government with the Committee for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, and the implementation of the relevant convention. Madam Rapporteur, national service remains one of the main causes for migration from Eritrea. We need to support your recommendations at national and regional level to improve the situation of conscripts there. Thank you. Thank you
very much. I'll give the floor to Norway.
Mr. Vice President, I would like to thank the Special Rapporteur for her briefing and express Norway's appreciation for her initiative to visit Norway early this year. The joint declaration of peace and friendship with Ethiopia is a positive step that could lay the ground for economic growth and improvements of living conditions for the people of Eritrea. We encourage Eritrea to follow up this positive momentum with domestic reforms. As a long-standing friend of Eritrea, Norway remains concerned about the human rights situation. Upholding human rights is an integral part of any government's obligations towards its citizens, and it is essential for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. It is vital to ensure transparency, both on progress made and on areas where improvements are needed. Norway encourages Eritrea to continue to cooperate with the various UN mechanisms to protect and promote human rights and remains committed to supporting Eritrea's efforts to fulfill its obligations. We would be interested to hear the views of the Special Rapporteur on how the UN and the international community could partner with Eritrea in advancing rule of law reforms. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll give the floor to the UK.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The United Kingdom welcomes the Special Rapporteur's work and her most recent report and recommendations. Whilst we welcome Eritrea's increasing engagement with some regional and international bodies, as members of this Council, cooperation with the Special Rapporteur's mandate would have been a positive development. We agree with the Special Rapporteur's findings that there is no evidence of a substantial improvement in human rights in Eritrea. The UK believes respect for human rights is vital for Eritrea's future, and we urge the government of Eritrea to respect and promote the human rights of all its people. An important start would be a plan to reduce the length of time spent on national military service from indefinite to a defined period of service. Whilst we recognise that Eritrea has made progress on maternal mortality, FGM and gender discrimination, we believe that increased cooperation, including assistance from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, could help Eritrea to better protect and promote human rights across the board, whilst also helping to implement their UPR recommendations. Madam Special Rapporteur, in this respect, what specific, immediate and priority technical assistance could help Eritrea implement these universal periodic review recommendations? Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. Now we shall turn to the list of speakers of a non-governmental organization, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Christian Solidarity Worldwide via intervention via video.
President, CSW thanks the Special Rapporteur for her important work. Eritrea is entering its second year as a member of the Council. However, its human rights crisis remains acute and requires continued scrutiny. Thousands of individuals remain detained on account of their religion or belief, including Christians, Jehovah's Witnesses and Muslims. Conditions of detention are inhumane and life-threatening, and many of those detained have experienced torture or other forms of ill treatment. Among those currently imprisoned is Abu Antonios, the legitimate patriarch of the Eritrean Orthodox Church. The nonagerian patriarch has been under house arrest since January 2007 after being removed from office in 2006 in violation of canon law and effectively excommunicated in a process which lacked legitimacy. He is severely diabetic and suffers from high blood pressure worsened by privations. Concern for the well-being of detainees is increased by the spread of COVID-19 in the country. Eritrea earlier claimed to have defeated the virus. However, new cases have been confirmed, and the earlier closure of Catholic health facilities has deprived the poorest of basic care. The pandemic poses a serious risk to life to those detained in unsatisfactory and inhumane conditions. CSW calls on Eritrea to release all prisoners of conscience, including those detained on account of their religion or belief. We also urge the Council to renew the mandate of the Special Rapporteur. Given the lack of progress towards meeting the 5 human rights benchmarks articulated in the Special Rapporteur's 2019 report, the mandate remains essential. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Human Rights Watch.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We welcome the ongoing efforts of the Special Rapporteur to shine light on the dire rights situation in Eritrea, despite many challenges. We regret that Eritrea still refuses to engage constructively with OHCHR and the mandate holder, who the government recently denounced as, quote, the mouthpiece of Eritrea's arch-enemies, unquote. Eritrea's denial of access and refusal to cooperate violates its membership obligations. There have been no tangible improvements in the rights situation in Eritrea, including against the benchmarks which this Council requested. Since the last dialogue, the country has taken no steps to reform its notorious indefinite national service system. Thousands of children were forced to go to the Sawa military camp to attend their final year of high school, where they face abuse and are channeled into indefinite national service. Individuals continue to be held incommunicado and detained indefinitely, denied basic due process rights, without access to legal counsel, judicial review or family visits, some for decades. Detention facilities are overcrowded and unsanitary, made worse by COVID-19 restrictions. When the Catholic Church leadership called for basic reforms last year, the government responded by taking over important religion-affiliated schools and confiscated all Catholic health facilities, leaving people in parts of the country without access to health care. Thousands of Eritreans this year alone, many children have fled into Ethiopia, a telling sign of the lack of tangible improvements back home. The Council has given Eritrea a number of opportunities to offer a constructive way forward, none of which have resulted in a shift of approach. Eritreans need to know that their government will continue to face Council scrutiny.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Sivakis.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Civicus and the Eritrean Movement for Democracy and Human Rights welcome the Special Rapporteur's report. We are alarmed that the human rights situation in Eritrea continues to be dire despite improved engagement with regional and international actors. Civic space remains closed with no free and independent press, and at least 16 journalists have remained in detention without trial for about 2 decades. We are severely concerned by the picture set out in the report of a culture of impunity for the perpetrators of human rights violations, of arbitrary and incommunicado detention, sometimes indefinitely, particularly of those expressing dissent, and of restrictions to peaceful assembly. Hundreds of thousands have fled the country in recent years, and humanitarian emergency has been born from the government's inadequate response to famine. These and many more raise long-standing concerns over continued refusal by the Eritrean government to cooperate adequately with the Special Rapporteur. This is particularly egregious given Eritrea's membership of this very Council. Where there is a lack of political will for domestic solutions, it is even more vital that international scrutiny remains. We urge the Council to ensure the continuation of this important mandate. We also call on the government of Eritrea to fully cooperate and allow access to the UN Human Rights Council mechanisms, as befits a member of this Council, and to take immediate steps to address its human rights and humanitarian emergency. Special Rapporteur, what more can the Council do to ensure that steps are taken towards achievement of the benchmarks? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I'll give the floor to United Nations Watch.
Madam President, today's report raises an important question. Eritrea is an elected member of this Human Rights Council. Under Resolution 6251, members are obliged first to uphold the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights, and second, to fully cooperate with the Council. Is Eritrea complying? Let us consider. First, according to Freedom House, Eritrea is an autocratic government that has never held a national election. In September 2018, Finance Minister Beran Abrehe was arrested for calling for a democratic transition. He is still in prison. Young Eritreans are forced into indefinite national service, which this Council's own inquiry in 2016 described as enslavement. Freedom of religion is also restricted. In 2019 alone, 250 Christians were arbitrarily detained in 2 waves of mass arrest for practicing their faith. Clearly, Eritrea fails to meet even a minimal standard on protecting human rights, let alone the highest. Second, does Eritrea cooperate with the Council? Well, the Special Rapporteur informs us that Eritrea denied her the access to visit the country and refuses to cooperate with her mandate. We ask the Special Rapporteur, given Eritrea's fundamental breach of its duties as a Council member, what action do you recommend? Madam President, when will the UN stop electing human rights abusers to this Human Rights Council? Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was the last speaker in our list. This brings us to the end of this interactive dialogue, and I wish to thank Ms. Kravitz for her participation today.